Good afternoon, members. My name is Marcus James. I manage Office Administrative Services here at American Coatings Association, and I am joined by Heidi McAuliffe. Heidi is ACA's Senior Vice President of Government Affairs, and we welcome you to this edition of the ACA Member Webinar Series. I did want to tell you before we hop into a couple of administrative notes. Unfortunately, our presenter today is having some technical issues with their camera. I'm not sure if that'll be fixed throughout the webinar, but we'll get going and see what happens there. As an attendee, you are in listen-only mode. If you have questions, we'd like you to please put those in the questions dialog box. There will be a Q&A at the end. We'll get your questions answered at that time. There's also a survey at the end. It's very brief, and we would appreciate your answers there to help us improve these webinars as we go throughout the series. And I'm going to hand this over to Heidi, who will tell us a bit about today's presenter. Heidi.
Thank you, Marcus. So today we welcome George Pilcher of ChemQuest to our webinar series. George is a longtime friend of the coatings industry and American Coatings Association. So George, I have a very short bio here. It doesn't really do justice to your career, but I'm going to go ahead and walk through it. So with over 50 years of experience in the paint and coatings industry, George Pilcher has served throughout his career as a strategic leader in a variety of technical, production, and marketing capacities. He has a strong global presence, drawn from frequent visits and variety of leadership roles in North and South America, Europe, and the Pacific Rim. He joined ChemQuest in 2007. He is in wide demand as a speaker at international venues on a broad array of topics, and he has published numerous articles, editorials, and papers in industrial, technical, and scientific journals. He has written several book chapters. Welcome, George. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure, and it's probably your pleasure that you can't actually see me right now. Nonetheless, let's get moving and go to the first slide because we're going to talk about the important topic of geopolitics and economic outcomes. During this 45 minutes that I have prior to the questions, I'd like to hit on the effects of geopolitics on the supply chain crisis. I'd like to talk about economic outcomes yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The trade outlook as we see it right now. Bear in mind that a lot is going on in the world right now, and so this really is a snapshot in time. This is not the usual sort of presentation that ChemQuest would be making, where we can look forward and with some reasonable degree of stability. I want to talk about tariffs. I know it's a politically divided topic, but it is something that everyone needs to think about regardless of your initial mindset. We'll go into the role of politics, both domestic and global, on the global trade and on the supply chains. We'll talk about learning from history, and then I'll have a few closing thoughts. Next slide, please. First of all, I am required to tell you a few things about ChemQuest. We are strategic thought partners. ChemQuest really goes beyond the role of what many people think of as a consultant. We've been in business since 1976, so we're heading toward our what would that be, our 50th anniversary. So we've been in this business longer than virtually any other consultant that I know of, and the reason is we're different. Our clients call on us to be thought leaders. We have a deep well of industry-specific experience. We have applications experience. We have relationships with almost anyone in the paint and coatings industry throughout the world. We understand the interconnected aspects of our clients' businesses, their offerings, the markets they're in, the industry, and we leverage that to achieve our mission. We operate in 4 basic areas: business strategy and transformation, technology development at our ChemQuest Technology Institute. We have experts in operational excellence to help companies add that additional 10 or 15% production capability when they find that they need it but don't yet have new equipment in place. and we do a fair amount of merger and acquisition advisory services. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is just a tiny sampling of what's coming to us every day these days, whether it's talking about, you know, the apocalypse in Los Angeles, or nuclear weapons in Iran, or the tariffs, or the Middle East conflict. It's just, there's a lot going on. Next slide, please. Recent changes in trade. This is not meant to be comprehensive, but it does give you a nice visual of what's going on. U.S. trade in Mexico and Canada is increasing, has been increasing, and trade with China has been about level between the U.S. and China, and it's declining noticeably between China and us. Now, this was happening between 2021 to 2023. It also happened in 2024. Going forward, we'll simply see more of this, interrupted possibly by the, or at least modified by the tariffs that were just announced, what was it, Tuesday evening, I think, against Mexico and Canada. But we believe those will work their way out. And if you look at these charts, it'll just give you some idea of how is trade moving around the world, because I want to talk about that. It's important how things are shifting. Next slide, please. Construction is really one of the growth engines. Construction and automotive are good examples of real growth engines in trade. I'll talk about the two of them. There are many others, of course. There's other areas, but if we look at, for instance, construction, we look at residential housing, non-residential housing, civil engineering. Those are good examples of the growth between 22 and what we forecast for 2025. If we and that's down the right-hand side, and you can see that residential is starting to grow a little globally. Construction total would be about a CAGR of 1.8%. So that's nothing to write home about, but these are all good news rather than bad news. They're all green rather than red. If we look at the output per region, you can see that North America is going to, in 2025, in construction, grow about 2.9%, whereas Asia Pacific is very little growth. And that's primarily due to a severe overbuilding in the PRC over the last 3 to 4 years. Europe is a little behind the U.S., and the Middle East is whizzing right along as we might anticipate. Next slide, please. We'll look at light vehicles. Here is the same thing. Asia Pacific is, of course, the powerhouse in global automotive output and growth. And 10 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. I mean, that speaks really directly to the amazing ability of China to decide to get into something and just do it. And they've really done an amazing job of that. Globally, we're looking at only 1.4% growth. In the Americas, 1.3%, Asia Pacific. So in terms of growth of overall vehicles, not particularly impressive for the years going forward. Well, for the years we're in right now, and it won't change a lot between now and 2028. If we look at the types, well, old-fashioned combustion engine vehicles are doing what we might think. They're just going to continue to drop in production. Electric vehicles are, as you can see, in 2022, did quite well. Now they're dropping, but that's partly a question of building an awful lot of them in 2022, and then questions of infrastructure coming up, and questions about the long-term stability, and questions of tariffs on Chinese-made electric cars. So it still shows that the growth in electric vehicles in 2025 will be a CAGR of 25%, which is just huge. hybrids at 12.8%. So this gives you some feeling for the changing dynamics within the automotive industry globally, despite any other characteristics that any other geopolitics that might be involved. Next slide, please. This is some version of an eye chart. I'm not going to try and read it to you, just to tell you so that when you get, you'll get a copy of this if you want one, and you can print it out and put it on your desk and follow with your finger, which is what I've had to do. But it contains a huge amount of information in terms of anything that's in green is growing, is increasing trade flow. Anything that's yellow is steady, and anything that's red is shrinking. And if you look at the very center of this and just see that thick red line going from the U.S. to China, that tells you something about the shrinkage there. The thickness of the lines also tells you exactly how much shrinkage is going on. So this is it's hard to speak to, but it's very, very interesting when you have a copy to look at and study. Just let your eyes and your fingers wander over this, and it will tell you volumes about what's going to happen, in our opinion, in terms of international trade growth by the year 2033. Trade growth and decline. Next slide, please. Okay, geopolitical outcomes. There's so many things driving, and this is not a comprehensive selection. The global drivers that affect trade are not just trade agreements and import and export controls, but domestic, environmental, labor, immigration policies, multilateral cooperations and alliances, whether it's NATO or whether it's the AUKUS, AUKUS. I'm not sure everyone knows what that is, but that's South American, and it involves Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and then Chile has an economic complementation agreement of some kind with AUKUS. But there are tariffs, trade barriers, domestic, environmental, labor, immigration policies. So there's a lot going on. There's conflicts, Ukraine, in the Red Sea, Taiwan, Ecuador, Gaza. So there's a lot going on right now, and it all has some effect. Sometimes augmenting effect, sometimes depleting effect on the movement of goods and services, but we're in a very complex period of time right now. Next slide. Okay, in terms of I'm just pulling out some really major things that are happening in the world. If you look across the top, you'll see that what I'm going to call the stronghold in America is, the trade growth remains resilient, and we're reshoring and friendshoring. This is probably the biggest single factor about North America in terms of geopolitical concerns. I haven't added tariffs there because at the time I selected this slide, we had not yet announced any tariffs, but that would be added to there. China is increasing trade with Russia and India and ASEAN, the Southeastern Asia countries. The global South is increasing trade everywhere, and that's from the equator South, not just South America, but that's India, that's Australia, that's New Zealand, that's a number of ASEAN countries that are below the equator. India is increasing trade everywhere. They're becoming a really major factor in trade, and will continue to do so. The EU is slowly shifting trade from China to the US, Japan, and India. If you look at the bottom, if anything's in red, it shows you where trade is declining. If it's in brown, it shows you where trade is going to increase, but not more than 2.9%, and everything in green shows where trade is going to increase, over the next 10 years by more than 2.9%. There again, this is something nice to have handy for you, because it just gives you a nice snapshot in time and the likelihood of what's coming. Next slide, please. Okay, keep going. There are going to be some supply change. There are supply change changes in the supply chain that have occurred, and there are some that are occurring, and there are those that are going to occur. Just-in-time inventory is dying. It may not be dead quite yet, but it's dying, because unless you're General Motors and you are the end of the supply chain, we discovered real quickly in 2020 and 2021 that JIT doesn't work. If you're involved in JIT, if that's how you try and run your business, it's important to really reconsider that. Reshoring and nearshoring for critical products is important from a logistics point of view, and it also accounts for a potential reduction in shipping costs. That's something that is important to maintain our supply chains in the future, because it's not a question of when is the next supply chain crisis going to occur. Is it going to occur? It's a question of when it's going to occur, and whether that's in this year or 2026 or 2029, it's going to happen again. We're going to have another supply chain crisis. There's too many things going on in the world of a negative nature to be corrected, to prevent that from happening. So this is why we are really encouraging everyone to take a look at, how you buy, where your supply chain leads to and where it leads from. Among the geopolitical considerations alone, and this is in addition to the factors that caused the supply chain crisis of 2020 and 2021. That was a lot of logistics, but here we're talking about, the resolution of the Russo-Ukrainian war, disruptions in the Suez Canal, problems in the Panama Canal, or, there may be issues with U.S. security that involve the Panama Canal. Tariffs and potential tariffs and the threats of tariffs and other geopolitical trade issues, potential invasion of Taiwan by China, the Greenland question. This isn't just a joke that a lot of people thought it was when President Trump brought it up 5 or 6 months ago. It's not just the question of the potential minerals on Greenland. It's a question of the GIUK corridor that runs between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. It's an important path through the Arctic to connect North America and Europe, and to connect Asia and Europe. And these are things we haven't really talked about in the past, but they are important now. Next slide, please. There's going to be material substitution. Well, we became very familiar with that a couple of years ago, but a lot of that is ongoing, and a lot of it is ongoing because people caught on to the idea when they had to that things sometimes need to be substituted during, as in the last supply chain crisis. And now, from a purely decorating point of view, a practical point of view, people are using different materials. So there's a lot of composite out there that used to be wood, that used to be concrete, that used to be metal. In decorative architecture, there are fewer paintable surfaces. In industrial and specialty, we're seeing, films, for instance. The automotive suppliers are building larger windows and thereby decreasing the paintable portion of a car. So the question of material substitution is one we need to watch carefully and work with all of our customers on, as paint suppliers, work with all of our customers on, being ahead of those trends whenever possible. Next slide, please. Market consolidation. This is ongoing. It was not at particularly high levels in 2024. I doubt that it's going to be at record levels or anything like that in 2025. But the big paint companies, the Sherwin-Williams, PPG, AkzoNobel, Nippon, they're driving a lot of merger and acquisition activity. And we continue to have labor shortages, not just here, but in other selected areas of the globe. And in Europe right now, they're basically in recession. So the whole question of availability of labor, either because you've got a little too much or you've got too little. In the US, it's too little. these will definitely have an impact on the future and in terms of especially your supply chains. Next slide, please. If we take a look at trade outlook for the world and try and put it in the easiest to understand terms, North America will continue to reduce its dependence on Asia in general, and especially on China. It's going to reduce its dependence on China, and it's going to align with other trade partners for the rest of commerce. Europe is going to do exactly the same thing. Its trade with China will be largely stagnant. It wants to be, the UK and the EU want to be less reliant on long-standing trade partners like China, and more reliant on trade partners like the US and Japan, and emerging markets like Turkey and Africa and India, but especially India. The global South. In the past, I think all of us tend to sort of ignore what goes on in the global South, because the impact on global trade has never been huge. In many cases, it's almost insignificant, but it's growing. It's growing, and the global South is a group of 133 developing nations, some of which are not developing properly, but some of which are, and they represent about currently 18% of global GDP, but they have 62% of the world's population. And as they continue to develop, they will look eventually kind of like India did 20 or 25 years ago, with a huge number of people, but not a significant number of consumers. Now India has evolved to the point where they have a huge number of consumers, and they're very sophisticated. So companies really have to consider the risks and the opportunities that are created by these geopolitical shifts, because they're going to alter supply chains, they're going to alter demands, they will then, by necessity, alter our business strategies and the way we develop our game plans for adapting to any situations that happen in the future, but at the very least to the shift in geopolitical trade. Next slide, please. China and India. China's trade with BRICS, it used to be, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but now we see there are more nations in there. It accounts for about 40% of China's forecast trade growth over the next decade. China's relationship with Russia is projected to increase significantly, and it has already in the last 2 years, but it will continue to grow to the point where by 2033, between now and 2033, there will be a 6.3 CAGR in bilateral trade between China and Russia. China's total trade growth is going to be limited to about 2.7% annually over the next decade, which is well below GDP of 3.8. But that's because China has run into a number of different problems internally and externally. India is emerging as a big global South trade story. It's pursuing trade with everybody. It's pursuing growth with everybody. And the Boston Consulting Group, which is pretty conservative, is predicting a growth of 6.4% CAGR for India's total trade through 2033, which is going to be roughly $1.8 trillion. So this is a big factor. And India's annual trade with the US is expected to more than double. Next slide, please. The antebellum trade outlook. Antebellum simply meaning before the war, but a trade war is on the horizon. At the time that I wrote this slide, we hadn't declared any trade wars. We were simply indicating that we would probably start a trade war, but we did start a trade war on Tuesday. So the effects of geopolitics is escalating. We're already witnessing seismic changes in global trade, just the pattern of global trade, and the very thought of a trade war is going to bring about very, very, very significant changes. The annual trade between the US and Mexico, there again, this is the antebellum book. This is what I wrote before there was actually a trade war. At that time was set to increase between US and Mexico by $315 billion between now and 2033. Canada, we expected to grow 147. Now, what I would like to say is this: a trade war can only go on so long. These numbers are going to be dented, but they're not going to be moved into an entirely different category of growth or an entirely different category of size. 315 billion between US and Mexico might drop to 290 or something like that. That's me saying that, not ChemQuest. But the point is this: there is going to be a dent. So these are numbers that, if without a trade war, would have applied. They will be damaged to some degree by the trade war, depending on how long it lasts and how severe it gets. The trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, USMCA, is up for renegotiation in 2026. At the moment, Washington and all of us, I suppose, should be very concerned about the fact that China is already trying to break into U.S. markets where it's not currently active by going into Mexico. So maybe selling steel to Mexico, having the Mexicans make cars out of that steel and then ship them into the United States. But they would like to broaden this to include many, many areas. So that becomes a geopolitical issue, which in the past would not have been a geopolitical issue. So a big question then is, how are we going to leverage the negotiation or the renegotiation of USMCA in 2026 to see if we can limit what comes from China through Mexico into the US, or if it's not possible to control. That it's important. It also leads us to the concept of friendshoring, because we're in the process of starting to redefine how the North American trade relationships. We can't repatriate, we can't reshore everything to the United States. But if we can, the businesses we can, we're clearly trying to do. Friendshoring is simply, making sure you have really, really tight trade agreements with in this case, with EU or with the UK or with possibly with the South American trading bloc. So friendshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, these are really important concepts that we didn't think too much about in the past. But as we plan for the future, as every company plans for the future, this has to be part of the strategy. It can't really be tactical. You can't do it fast enough, but you can do it strategically over a period of years. Next slide, please. Continuing with that thinking, China's trade with the US and EU is slowing, but it is growing strongly in much of the rest of the world. So the two-way trade between China and the West will be a negative, about 221 billion by 2033. It's going to drop by that much. So it'll be an annual decline of 1.2% between 2025 and 2033. That's a lot. Now, the cost of imported Chinese goods that do come into this country are going to increase by more than 200 billion if no alternative sources are available and if import volumes remain constant. And this is one of the many reasons why the trade with China between Europe and North America is in decline, because a continuation of trade levels does not paint a pretty picture. We project that China's trade with the global South is going to surge, however, partly because of the the relationships that China is trying to build, has been trying to build for the last 5 or 6 years with the Middle East and with South America. The Silk Road concept. In any event, this shift, if something doesn't stop it, and I don't think anything can, it will support China's geopolitical agenda of reducing its economic reliance on the West, while significantly strengthening its ties with major emerging markets. Next slide. Tariffs. Okay, this is a genuinely complex issue. My simple look at tariffs based on history tells me that they usually do provide short-term relief. They often give the public a psychological high. Okay, those are the positives, but they are short-term. The negatives are that they typically act as painkillers, and that's part of why the public gets a psychological high. But like painkillers, they just give temporary relief. And President Trump alluded to this in his speech with the nation a couple of days ago, that yes, there is going to be some pain, but as he put it, well, just a little pain. And the implication being that in the long term, everything will be just fine. Go to the next slide, please. Everything might be just fine, but historically, it never has been. So this would have to be a new situation, and certainly there's room for new situations in a rapidly changing geopolitical world. But if we look back at history, the Great Depression was fueled, in the view of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by sky-high tariffs. And if the historians look back now and they say, yes, that's exactly what happened. And it's going to be the historians which will look back on this period of time and say, well, this was successful or that wasn't successful. Tariffs worked or tariffs were a bad mistake. It's always something you find out in the future, which is why I'm so big on saying, you need to look to the past if you want to really predict the future. And so if we continue to look at the past and what we're doing in the present, tariffs reduce the demand for foreign goods, and generally speaking, that's going to strengthen the dollar, and then that's going to lead to lower demand for American goods from the rest of the world. A very impressive supply chain and operations management report was recently written by Georgia State University, Colorado State, Arizona State, and Kuwait University, working together, and they felt that the tariffs enacted in 2018 had a ripple effect of unintended consequences that negatively affected the supply chains. There again, history will be the one who tells us for a fact, did that happen or not? To us, it looks like it did. The 2018 tariffs increased costs by $51 billion a year, shouldered principally by U.S. companies and consumers. We know that for a fact. We've got those numbers. So it was very expensive. Tariffs are very, very expensive, generally speaking, for consumers and for producers. So we all have to get ready for that. Ultimately, someone's got to pay for it. And contrary to the statement that it will be the countries who are importing into the U.S., it won't be. It's going to be consumers and producers. Next slide, please. So trade wars and tariffs, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but we have to be ready. We have to be ready for the results of the tariffs. Waiting for the tariffs to have their full effect means that businesses who are swallowing losses will get to the point where they just can't do it anymore. Then they'll have to put through price increases. The minute a tariff hits, that's the minute that you have to be ready for, and you have to have given thought ahead of time to what are you going to do when there's a tariff. Businesses that have done their homework in the last 6 or 7 months are prepared right now about what to put through this week, what to say to their customers, how to work with their customers. Next slide, please. just there again, a hypothetical snapshot in time. I put this together back when a month or a month and a half ago, when we were talking about a 60% tariff on China and a 10% tariff on other nations. At the moment, we have, I believe, a 10% tariff on China and 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, with additional ones to be announced. But this just gives you a good visceral look at what would happen if those were the tariffs right there. International trade, which is the sum of imports and exports, would drop by 23%. Factory output would drop by 7.2%. Logistics jobs would drop by 3.2%. Core consumer price inflation would be 1.3%. Steel prices will go up 4.2%, and auto prices and parts will go up 6.5%. These are real numbers. I mean, I'm projecting these, but whatever we get, unless we do not proceed with our tariff plan as it has been announced, will be on this order. And these are very significant numbers. Next slide, please. The role of politics, domestic and global. We talk about depleting, if we talk about deporting children of illegal immigrants born in the US, we're talking about 300,000 workers. There again, I'm not trying to move forth with any political agenda, just statements of fact. The current industrial unemployment in the US is around 3.6%. If we were to remove 300,000 workers, we'd have a disaster. Where are those workers? Well, they're in seasonal harvesting. They're in farm workers. They're migrants. They are not illegal immigrants with criminal records. Some of them are. The bulk of them, even if they are illegal immigrants or children of illegal immigrants, they are working, tax-paying people. So, just moving out a couple 100,000 will make a very serious impact on certain parts of the U.S. economy. Tariffs as political tools are interesting, but a tariff as a revenue generator, generally speaking, isn't going to work, because if we hit China with a 10% tariff on Tupperware or any other product you can name that they basically make and ship here, they're going to raise their prices by 10%. So the government will get 10% from China, and they can apply that to the general fund, but you and I will all pay 10% more in the grocery store. So it is, in the long haul, it's not a good thing to be doing, but as a political tool, it may be a very good thing to be using. So in the short term. Next slide, please. In terms of domestic politics, there are roles played by corporate greed, by lessons learned from 2021 through 2023, and lessons not learned. Contract negotiations between raw material suppliers and paint and other specialty chemical customers. We really have to be asking ourselves, what did we learn from the great supply chain crisis? To what extent did we learn our lessons? To what extent has that learning been effective? One important thing is the raw material supplier ratings. If you supply to somebody, you probably rate them as A, B, and C customers. If you don't, you really should. You really should, because even though resin supplier D may be required to sell resin E to large global company F during good times, just because of the sheer volume, what we discovered among our clients, which is a very realistic, significant statistical number of businesses in the U.S., was that some of those former A customers, who were A because they were gigantic, suddenly became C customers and D customers. And if 5 or 6 companies were waiting for one truckload of resin F, it quite often went to a small company, not a large company, because it was the small company who was not who was not buying on price, they were buying on value. They were actually creating the lauded partnerships with their raw material suppliers that we are also familiar with in terms of the phrase, but which doesn't happen an awful lot in the real world. Next slide, please. Geopolitical concerns in terms of what's going on out there. Just think for a moment. China used to produce phthalocyanide pigments and then send them to India for finishing. They did that 6-7 years ago. Now China can produce and finish phthalocyanide blue. They are in the process of trying to destroy the Indian marketplace. The Houthis are causing all kinds of problems in the Red Sea. I guess it's tempered for the moment, but you know, at the drop of a hat, that activity can start up again. American interference in Panama. I mean, I've mentioned some of these before. What are the implications of the Russian-Ukrainian war? All of these things, PFAS, regulatory things that are global. This is all coming down on us, and this is all geopolitical. Next slide, please. Just a few other concerns. Let me just highlight one. We're trying to reduce our dependence on China. China produces 42% of all of the world's epoxy resin, 44% of all of its chemicals, 50% of the world's steel, 70% of all rare earth ore, and 90% of all refined rare earth metals. This is not casual. This is deadly serious. I mean, they have a hammerlock, okay? How do you get out of that? I don't know. It doesn't happen overnight, but it has to happen at some point. And then there's the cost of transportation. I mean, what's happening to the cost of transportation now? We know that it spiked dramatically during the supply chain crisis of 2020 and 2021. But what's it doing now? Let's take a quick look. Next slide. Take a look at geopolitical. This is trucking rates, okay? Look where they were in 2019, December of 2019, or in early December 2020, way down. Then you can see the spike during the supply chain crisis, but it hasn't come down to any more than just half of the increase. So it went up dramatically. It did not come down dramatically. Next slide. Rail. Basically, it comes up, it goes down, it comes up, it goes down. But if you draw the straight line, the cost of rail cost is simply going up consistently. Next slide. Shipping containers. They have come down, but it was around in 2019 and 2021, 22. More or less, a container went from $1,400 a ship up to as much as $20,000 or $30,000. These are averages here, but the averages, it went from $1,500 to $6,000. Now it's down to $3,500, but it's not down anywhere near the $1,400, $1,500, $1,600, $1,700 where it was before the supply chain crisis took its full effect. Next slide, please. So learn from history or perish. A few of my favorite quotes, I'm not going to read them all, but you know, the quote from Cicero is the one that I have always used as a guide. It's never failed me yet in 50 years in this industry. And what he said was, history is the study in the present of the past about the future. And if you want to know the future, you must know your past, and that's from George Santayana. And these are from you know, BC right up to modern times. Next slide, please. Next slide. Here's what we saw in the supply chain crisis of 2021 to 2023. The only important point I want to make here is you see very little in terms of geopolitical concerns. The next supply chain crisis is not going to be like the last one. The next one requires us to think in a different way. Next slide, please. These are key points about that crisis. Longer delivery times, empty shelves, changes in consumer demand. There were factory closures. Behavior of the average consumer was simply changed because of what they could and could not get, how desperate they were or were not for toilet paper. Industries affected were especially in the manufacturing sector, electronics, automotive, consumer goods. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk now quickly about timeless lessons that should have been learned already, but have not been learned by many people and companies from the last supply chain crisis. Just-in-time delivery is basically dead. It can only work when the chain is when you're the focal point of the chain. Next slide. Every raw material used to make paint and coatings in the US should have at least one reliable vendor in the US. That was not the case 5 years ago. It's becoming more the case now, but not nearly as much as it should be. Having a single source of any raw material is a bad idea. Yes, you can certainly single source to get larger truckload, get full truckloads and so forth, and get better prices. But a better price will not do you nearly as much good as better value, and it won't do you nearly as much good as having multiple suppliers. These are just lessons that we learned from what happened last time, from our customers, from our clients. Certain high-profile manufacturing operations really should be repatriated to the U.S., and that's one of the reasons we're seeing certain electronics coming back to the U.S. We're seeing cells and so forth. Next slide. Finally, research and development pretty much stopped during that period of time. The companies that kept it going were fast out of the gate in 2023, and they did much better than their competitors because they didn't lose 1.5 to 2 years of new products. So my advice would always be absolutely nothing should prevent at least a minimum amount of true R&D taking place, even in the darkest hours. Next slide, please. Few closing thoughts. How can you best deal with geopolitical trade issues? Develop resilient and transparent supply chains. Build a geopolitical view. Become informed about your own supply chain. I mean, not just who you're buying from, but who they're buying from and who they're buying from, and what raw materials go into their products. You know, if you know that cobalt comes, let's just say, only from South Africa and goes into certain pigments, you then at least are ahead of the game in knowing that if something goes wrong in South Africa, if you start getting hints that something's going to happen in South Africa or in another African nation that mines for cobalt, you can do something about it, and you can do it a couple of years in advance by being aware. Strengthen the decision-making processes. Agility is going to be more important in the future than it's been in the past, and it's been very important in the past. If you can expand your presence in the growth markets, do so. That's not news, but it's something that still a lot of companies would prefer to say, I have my footprint, I want to stay right there. It is good staying in your own footprint, but that doesn't prevent you from taking advantage, going out on the limb a bit into growth markets. Invest in regional differentiation. So these are just good ideas. What I feel are the things that if you concentrate on and actually create strategy rather than reacting directly to circumstances will certainly help you deal with the coming supply chain crisis. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, George. This is Marcus. We'll go ahead and hop into the Q&A. Do you think that JIT inventory has been hurt by suppliers because companies are trying to keep low overhead or because of shipping constraints?
Well, there's a little of both there, but at the moment, it's strictly trying to keep ahead. I mean, you know, trying to keep the inventory as low as possible. But there's a lot to be said for just in, you know, for just in case. Instead of just in time, just in case. We should have learned that we all should be buying certain types of inventory just in case. And that comes from a study of what's happening in that particular raw material chain. So if you know that there's a strike in the ore mines for titanium bearing ore, then you're probably going to be smart buying just in case titanium dioxide. That's an obvious example, and that's been going on for decades. But the same thing is going to be true of all of your other raw materials. It really does require that the supply chain management be keener and more well-informed than ever before. Does that help?
Yep. And yep, I think we're good. We'll go to the next one. Yes. This refers to slide 19, the first line on FDR. Why do tariffs discourage investment?
What?
Why do
I can't see
tariffs?
19.
Can you hear me, George?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yep. The question is, why do tariffs discourage investment? The question is from slide 19.
Yeah, there again, does it discourage all parties from investing? Not necessarily, but as you saw when we announced Canadian and Mexican and smallish Chinese Mexicans on Tuesday, the market just tumbled because it means that prices are going to go up. It means that inflation is going to go up, none of which is good for the market.
All right. What 2 or 3 changes in global trade do you think will have the most negative impact on U.S. industrial manufacturing and the supply chain?
What 3 changes?
What 3 changes in global trade do you think will have the most negative impact on U.S. industrial manufacturing and the supply chain?
I think tariffs on steel would be the most important one because the last time we had a tariff on steel, the price of domestic produced steel just skyrocketed. It will skyrocket again. I would say the consumer, as the trade patterns change, and especially if there are tariffs involved, the consumer will be paying more for fruits and vegetables, certain food staples, not meat, but fruits and vegetables that are imported from other parts of the world. The third part for industrial manufacturing, I think it's just, I think I don't even know, we don't even know how to answer that question because there are so many factors that if this happens, that won't happen. If something else doesn't happen, something else will happen. I think we're facing so many conflicting potential scenarios right now that for me to pick one out for industrial manufacturing would be difficult, other than steel.
Yep. We appreciate it, George. Well, we're almost to the top of the hour here. I want to close out with a couple of upcoming webinars that we have. March 18th, we'll have our State Affairs Network update, and this will include the states of Kentucky, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. And if you haven't attended one of these, you can look forward to updates from ACA's lobbyists in those states, along with government affairs staff here at ACA, and topics will cover PFAS, chemicals management, packaging, extended producer responsibility initiatives, and other issues of interest to our industry. And on March 20th, we will have overview of US EPA's final amendments to the National Aerosol Coatings Rule. This webinar will be led by Rhett Cash, who is ACA's counsel, ACA's Council Government Affairs. And on March the 25th, we will have another state affairs update. This one will cover the states of Maryland, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Texas. And again, that will be led by ACA's lobbyists in those states, along with ACA's government affairs staff. I will distribute a PDF of today's slides. I'll send those around this afternoon. The recording will be available soon on paint.org in the Member Center. And I want to thank George again for giving this presentation this afternoon, spending this time with our members. And everyone have a good afternoon, and we'll look to see you on March the 18th.